"Where do you think you're going, little girl?" The voice cracked through the quiet hum of the plane's cabin with an edge sharp enough to silence the soft shuffle of feet. Cleo had only taken a few curious steps toward the luxurious first-class section when it stopped her cold. The voice didn't wait for an answer. A firm hand gripped her arm a little too tightly, and within seconds, the child's joyful curiosity turned into confusion. The flight attendant's face tightened, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as if the tiny frame in front of her had committed some high crime. "You people always try to sneak up here." That's when everything shifted. The words were not whispered. They were thrown with that particular kind of casual venom, the kind that pretends to be about rules, policies, or protocol, but smells unmistakably of bias. Have you ever been judged before you even spoke a word? Have you been looked at not for who you are, but for the assumptions others make the second you enter a room? Where are you from? If you've ever faced discrimination, or believe it has no place on earth, hit that subscribe button and share this story. Let's make sure stories like these are seen, heard, and never forgotten. Cleo wasn't just a curious kid fumbling her way to a plush seat or a complimentary glass of orange juice. She was simply doing what any other 9-year-old would, exploring with wide eyes and an unbothered heart. She had never been taught that her skin might be a warning sign for someone else. Until today. The flight attendant's name was Sharon. Calm only on the surface, she held herself like someone who had long since decided who did or did not belong in spaces like these. She wore a prim vest and a tight smile and walked through the cabin as if she owned it, unaware that she was, in fact, standing on someone else's ground, unaware that the plane wasn't just owned by an airline, but by the girl's own father. In the third row of business class, Julius Page sat still, his frame quiet but imposing. He wore a casual hoodie, jeans, and the soft, almost invisible authority of a person who no longer needed to prove anything. His eyes followed every movement, the angle of Sharon's grip on Cleo's arm, the crude disbelief in her voice, the split-second silence of other crew members who stood by but said nothing. He didn't rise. Not yet. He knew this language well. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came wrapped in smiles, rules, or assumptions. Sometimes it came in the form of a woman dragging your daughter back from a space she had every right to explore. He watched not because he was weak, but patient. Too many times, he'd handled things too quickly, silencing the aggressor without giving others the chance to see their own systems in action. Too often, abuse was dismissed as exaggeration unless there was proof dripping from a phone screen or captured on a shaky video. So this time he waited. Let the truth speak for itself. Let it echo in the ears of witness, camera, and conscience. Across the narrow aisle, 2 older passengers, dressed in matching golf polos, paused mid-conversation. One raised an eyebrow. The other shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Sharon, however, seemed energized. She had taken the blind trust of her power and wrapped it around herself like armor. "You don't belong here," she said through pursed lips, tilting her head at Cleo as if trying to sniff out a lie. "Where are your parents? Are you even supposed to be on this flight?" Cleo, unsure now if she had done something wrong, mumbled something about her daddy sitting a few rows back, but Sharon didn't hear the words. What she saw was little brown skin in a soft pink jacket, the kind worn by children of fathers without a last name heavy enough to matter. Julius's presence was too quiet to be seen, and that was exactly how he wanted it. A test for everyone on board. The other attendant, a young man barely out of flight academy, looked on with slightly parted lips but didn't move. You could see it floating in his eyes, doubt, discomfort, and fear of saying the wrong thing. Cleo began to cry, not from pain alone, but the confusion of being treated like an intruder inside a space meant for comfort. Julius's gaze deepened, but still he remained seated, one hand on the armrest, the other thumb slowly circling the ring on his finger, a nervous habit rarely seen, but meaningful only to those who knew the weight it carried. It was the same ring he'd worn the day he'd signed the papers to acquire Skywell Aviation Group 6 years ago. Back then, investors laughed. A black founder in tech, fine. But corporate aviation, they called it a vanity move. Then came the numbers. Then came the patents. Then came the fleet. And yet still, in their own skies, his child could not walk freely. The moment before truth reveals itself is easy to miss. It often looks ordinary, like a father leaning forward in his seat, like a $100 sneaker tapping softly on a luxury carpet, like a plane rolling quietly toward altitude while prejudice tears through the aisle. But the truth? The truth was only getting started. And for the hands that had tried to clip his daughter's wings, she was about to learn just how high they could fly. Time slows in moments like these. For little Cleo, it felt like the entire plane had gone quiet, except for her heartbeat, which thumped loudly in her ears as she tried to understand what she had done wrong. The plush, cream-colored carpet that lined the aisle beneath her feet now seemed like dangerous terrain. The wide, glossy windows of first class no longer looked magical, but far away, unreachable. Her arm still stung slightly from where the flight attendant, Sharon, had grabbed her a moment ago. But it wasn't the sting that brought the tears to her eyes. It was the voice, the tone, and the look. It was the cold way Sharon had spoken to her, as if every polite word had been wrapped in poison. She had only been gone from her seat for 2 minutes. 2 tiny minutes. She had seen other children wander on flights before. Sometimes a calm crew member guided them back to their parents. Sometimes they smiled and handed over a cookie or a set of airline wings. This wasn't that. As Sharon continued to glare at her, a few passengers glanced over, some curious, others concerned. But no one intervened, not yet. The tension crackled like static. Something was off, but the moment wasn't loud enough to call action. Not yet. Back in row 3, Julius Page saw everything. Every facial twitch, every calculated pause. The way Sharon adjusted her vest with pride, as if to signal her role gave her permission to humiliate. He could also see how his daughter was holding herself, shoulders no longer excited, hands nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. He wanted to move, to call her back with a smile and erase this moment. But he didn't. Not because he lacked the courage, but because the world needed to see what happened when there were no cameras, no titles, and no consequences. Let them act like no one's watching, he thought. Let the truth reveal itself. Because the truth, when it finally comes, doesn't knock at the door, crashes through it. Sharon began asking questions. Too fast, too firm, every one of them barbed with suspicion. Who brought you here? Where did you get on? Are you traveling alone? Her questions weren't really questions at all. They were accusations dressed up in buttons and professionalism. And no matter what Cleo said, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The issue was never the seat she wandered into. It was the skin she arrived with. Sharon's voice grew sharper as she whispered something into her earpiece. A small security call. Standard procedure, she would say later. A routine check. But there was nothing routine about a 9-year-old child being treated like a trespasser on her own father's plane. Another flight attendant, Daniel, came forward, hesitant and confused. He looked at the child, then at Sharon, unsure what he was walking into. You could tell by his hesitation that even he sensed the imbalance. His eyes flicked toward Julius, though the man had not moved an inch. Still seated, still silent. Passengers began to notice. A woman too rose up, leaned slightly into the aisle, watching with concern. Her husband beside her put down his magazine. A businessman in first class shifted uncomfortably as he caught fragments of Sharon's raised voice. Tension had begun to spread like slow ripples in water. Sharon, however, was undeterred. The more she assumed authority, the more she clung to it. She requested backup from the ground team, signaling to have the minor passenger evaluated. That was the word she used. Evaluated. As if Cleo was a miscalculation, an error in the system. And still Julius sat. Not out of fear. Out of purpose. He wanted them to reveal how they treated people when they didn't know who was in power. He had always believed we learn more about a system from how it treats the quiet, the overlooked, the ones without voice. What he didn't expect, what shook him at his core, was how fast it all escalated. Sharon reached for the child's arm again, this time with more pressure, telling her to step back right now. Cleo flinched, not because she was being defiant, because she was scared. Her cheeks were now wet with silent tears. Daniel stepped forward, attempting to interrupt the tension with calm. But Sharon shut him down with a glare. She had made a decision. She would see it through. The idea that she might be wrong never crossed her face. And yet, behind the curtain dividing first class from the rest of the cabin, whispers were beginning. Passengers tilted their phones slightly, just enough to document what felt more like misconduct than miscommunication. One passenger texted her sister, "This poor kid is getting harassed. On a private flight?" Another whispered to a man in a suit beside her, "Why is that woman so angry at the little girl?" What began as frustration was now becoming fear. And Julius? He felt every beat of it in his chest. He hated that his daughter was learning this lesson so young. Hated that her innocence now held bruises shaped like assumptions. It would have been so easy to stand, say his name, shut it down. But something deeper was unfolding. Something that needed to be seen not just by the passengers and crew, but by the world. He watched Sharon press her earpiece again. He watched Daniel try once more to speak. He saw 3 different passengers hit record on their phones. And then he finally moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly, deliberately. He stood 1 foot at a time. And while nothing was said, everyone in the cabin felt it. A shift, like the calm that comes before a sky cracks open with lightning. They had no idea who he was yet, but soon they would. And there'd be no boarding pass strong enough to walk them back from what they were about to learn. As Julius Page rose from his seat, the cabin shifted, subtly, imperceptibly at first, but in ways that human instincts rarely miss. The low hum of the aircraft, once enough to lull travelers into private silence, now seemed louder in the stillness that followed his quiet movement. Eyes tracked him, slowly at first, then abruptly. Not because he said anything, not because of what he wore, just jeans and a hoodie, travel casual, but because his steps carried something indescribably steady. There was no panic in his face, no exaggerated anger, only a presence. The kind of presence that comes not from status, but from certainty. By now, the plane had crossed into altitude, 30,000 feet in the air, and yet gravity seemed heavier in the space surrounding Seat 3D. Cleo's small form stood frozen near the aisle divider, tears drying slowly on her cheeks. Still confused, still heartbroken in that unique, awful way children feel when they've been treated as less than human and don't yet understand why. Her hands were clenched now, wrapped tightly around the edges of her sleeves, head low and shoulders smaller than they had ever looked to Julius. She didn't even know her father had stood up. She didn't need to. She always knew he would come. What was once an isolated moment between a white flight attendant and a black child was now a public happening unfolding at 36,000 feet before an unwilling but present jury of passengers. A growing collective of observers, silent at first, then quietly judgmental, now actively present in their interpretation of the scene. The moral pitch of the flight had changed. Karen, the crew lead, tall, rigid, wrapped in the expected decorum of mid-level training and watered-down authority, stiffened at the sight of Julius walking forward. For the split second it took her to process who he might be. She assumed he was just another concerned parent rushing to smooth things over. Still, she squared her shoulders. She was in charge here, or so she believed. Daniel, the junior attendant, stood between Karen and Cleo now, his face uncertain. He looked down the aisle and caught Julius's gaze just for a heartbeat. Something in that gaze stopped him from speaking, said, "Wait, watch." The passengers sensed something was happening. Phones were already out. Anything subtle was now fully in the realm of recorded. From row 5, a woman whispered to the man next to her that she'd never seen anything quite like this. He nodded without taking his eyes off the aisle. The tension had its hooks deeply embedded in every empty pause. But still, no words from Julius. He didn't need them. Not yet. His fingers reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief, white cotton, ironed that morning, and knelt beside Cleo. Gently, he wiped the streaks from her cheeks. One hand rested on her shoulder, not to protect, but to remind. "I'm here. I see you. You're safe." Her small frame leaned instinctively into his. Finally, Karen asked the question everyone else didn't dare to. Is she with you? And there it was. The moment when dignity meets disbelief. It was never phrased, "Are you her father?" Or, "Can I help you?" It came wrapped instead in doubt, strained through suspicion disguised as procedure. Julius looked up, not at Karen but past her, to the entire cabin. To those watching, those recording, those questioning their silence now that the truth had a shape. When you're black in high spaces, you learn that truth alone often isn't enough. It must be performed, printed, proven 3 times over before it's allowed to breathe. But Julius wasn't interested in performing. He was about to let the system perform for itself. Karen began to speak again. Something about misunderstanding, about verifying the child's name, about how quickly things had unfolded. Reluctant backpedaling. Not an apology, just the quiet panic of someone realizing they might have mistaken power for passivity. But it was too late for her words, because the passengers saw what had happened. They saw a black child treated like a threat. They saw a man kneel, not in fear or submission, but in grace and control. They saw the systems of subtle racism tremble the moment they were finally held accountable. Row 8 muttered amongst themselves. 2 women who had initially looked away from the conflict now whispered about how differently the crew would have reacted if Cleo had looked a little blonder, a little paler. In the first row, a corporate executive from a well-known tech firm began composing an email to her team. A reminder that unconscious bias can become quite conscious when left unchecked. Back at the rear, a Gen Z teen live-streamed the whole thing, adding bold text. "This is how you protect your daughter when they don't know you own the sky." The video was already gathering traction online. But none of this noise touched Julius in that moment, because his gaze was still on Cleo. As he leaned closer, he whispered something quiet, something meant only for her. Whatever the words, they worked. Her breathing slowed. Her hands released their grip. One foot gently slid back into comfort next to his. He took her hand as he stood up. That single clasp was an answer. To Karen's question. To the witnesses. To the nervous, hidden thoughts of everyone seated who ever wondered if calm could really hold power. As Julius turned toward the front of the plane, his tall frame casting long shadows across the aisle, every step pulled the moral weight of the story toward its climax. They didn't know yet. Not the full truth. Not that he wasn't just a father. Not that the plane they stood on belonged to him. Not simply the aircraft, but the fleet. But soon they'd know. And when they did, every word spoken, every hand that stayed still, every glance that turned away, would have its echo. Some truths don't arrive with a loud bang. They walk in, quiet and unannounced, letting their weight do the speaking. Julius Page continued his steady walk up the narrow aisle of the luxurious private aircraft, his hand gripping Cleo's gently. Her small fingers curled around his, reassured now, the tremble in her shoulders beginning to fade. But the look in her big, tear-stained eyes, wide and searching, told its own story. She hadn't yet learned how prejudice wraps itself in official uniforms and smiles that pretend to help. But today's lesson had just been taught. Cruelly, completely. He reached the front of the aircraft where the divider between first class and the rest of the cabin stood like a gate. Only it wasn't made of metal or glass. It was made of assumptions. Karen stood still, her hands folded stiffly over her clipboard, trying to hold onto a professionalism that had already crumbled. Daniel took a small step backward, unsure whether to remain involved or retreat quietly. Passengers all along the aisle were silent now. Some leaned forward, others clutched phones loosely in their hands. Most didn't know the full story yet, but they knew something had happened, something that didn't sit right. And the man who approached the front of the cabin now moved like someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything had shifted because of him. There's a kind of authority that doesn't need to be announced. It just is. Julius paused at the bulkhead near the cockpit, glanced back toward the cabin full of curious onlookers. A slow, wide-eyed glance that was both observation and invitation. An unspoken question. "Do you see now?" For a moment no one moved. Even the air felt still, like it held its breath. Karen opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps to regain control through some shallow act of apology. But Julius didn't give her space to speak. Not because he was aggressive, but because her words would have been too small to fix what she'd already broken. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small leather sleeve. Simple, black, and unmarked, save for a discreet silver emblem along the edge. From it, he pulled a single card, no more than standard size, but carried with the weight of a name that sat in headlines, boardrooms, and shareholder reports. It was a founder's badge. Not flashy, not public, but one known by every senior crew member in the aviation world. The kind handed personally to only a handful of individuals in the airline's top executive circle. And it had only 3 initials in the corner. JMP Julius Marcus Page. Karen's eyes dropped to the card and froze. In half a second, every layer of assumed superiority shattered. All the judgments that danced through her mind earlier, the certainty she was disciplining a lost child or protecting a private cabin from trespassers, collapsed under the truth. She hadn't slapped a class boundary. She had smacked the daughter of the man who owns the skies she flies in. The man who created the very cabin she thought she was guarding. Passengers began piecing it together too. Whispers rippled softly, like layers of wind brushing across water. One of them recognized the name. Julius Page, the tech billionaire who pivoted from cloud computing to aviation 5 years ago and redesigned what private air travel looked like for dozens of elite clients. The one who spoke at a global summit last year about inclusive access and human dignity in luxury service. She remembered now. He had worn the same ring, the same calm stare. Another passenger sat up straight. He had shared a lounge with Julius once in Dubai but never realized until now who he was sharing air with. All those people who had sat in quiet judgment. All those who thought Julius was just another dad in sneakers, silent, ordinary, not worthy of elite treatment, now began shifting in their seats. Not just because they misjudged a man, but because they misjudged what dignity looks like when it doesn't arrive in a tailored suit or a gold-plated watch. Julius didn't say a grand speech. He didn't need to. He simply tucked the card away. Because proving power isn't about flashing it. It's about making space for others to recognize the truth on their own. Karen now looked visibly shaken. Her voice, confident earlier, seemed caught in her throat. Daniel stepped forward, his posture softer, regret already creasing his brow. But Julius wasn't focused on them anymore. He turned his attention to Cleo. He bent down and gently brought her close. One soft hand on her cheek. One firm look that said everything would be okay. Behind them, a phone buzzed with a notification. Then another. Breaking. Child confronted on private flight belongs to aviation tycoon Julius Page. The story had begun to travel, and the world was watching. Social feeds started flooding with footage. Some captured the moment Karen grabbed Cleo. Others the moment Julius revealed who he was. People everywhere now saw what had happened when power dressed in a hoodie. It wasn't the first time a black child had been treated like a disruption, but it might be the last time someone like Karen did so without consequence. Back at the rear, a woman whispered to her seatmate, "I judged him too." The man beside her nodded. We all did. It wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about the culture that made her feel so sure she'd done the right thing until the mask broke. Until the story changed. Julius took Cleo's hand again, walked her back down the aisle toward their seats. No longer to prove anything, but to let her see. She didn't have to disappear into shame. She belonged here, always did, and now everyone knew it. No ticket required. For a moment, the cabin felt like a gallery frozen in time. Eyes tracing the edges of truth as it revealed itself, line by deliberate line. Julius Page, now seated again beside Cleo, didn't look any different than he had an hour earlier. Same relaxed clothes, same quiet demeanor, same worn hoodie with soft folds from years of use. And yet everyone's eyes saw him differently now. The reveal hadn't come with noise. There was no shouting, no declaration of who he was. No retaliation or rage, though the moment easily justified both. Instead, there was something even harder for the guilty to face. Grace. Quiet, grounded, intentional grace. In silence, Julius had unmade years of assumptions. Years of habits, how people search the faces of strangers on planes, how they rank value by design, by seat number, by skin tone. With one small movement, a card flashed from his coat pocket. The balance shifted. He didn't need applause. He didn't need revenge. He had something rarer: control. Karen had retreated to the crew space at the front of the plane, her face pale, almost translucent, as if whatever authority she believed she had spilled between her fingers. Her carefully curated smile, once tightly pressed into the grooves of her face, no longer held. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup of water, but the cup rattled against the counter. Nothing about her mirrored the woman who had yanked a child by the wrist moments ago. Down the aisle, the hum of whispers swelled. Opinions spilled across quiet voices and trembling thumbs dancing on phone screens. Some had already posted short clips of the earlier encounter. Others held their phones low, reading fast-growing comment threads. The story was spreading beyond the fuselage of that one jet. Passengers, who just an hour ago had kept their heads low to avoid conflict, were now carefully aligning their posture, with the man who in quiet defiance reminded an entire system of its own reflection. Julius sat calm, knees bent toward Cleo, his arm resting easily along the seat back. She leaned into him instinctively, the embarrassment on her face slowly giving way to pride. The sting of the flight attendant's words had not left her yet, nor the print of false accusation. But now, she watched the room treat her differently. Like the shift in weather when clouds lift after a storm. Someone had finally seen her, seen them, and more than that, the world was watching. Word didn't just spread, it exploded. By the time the plane descended toward landing, multiple outlets had already reached out to Julius's company's PR office for comments. The video clip of the moment Karen confronted Cleo had gone viral, not because it was shocking countless families had endured quiet discrimination on flights, but because this time the scales tilted differently. This time, the target was the daughter of a black billionaire who stayed quiet just long enough to show everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Most kids her age would have asked questions, would have tugged on a parent's sleeve and whispered, "Why did she do that?" But Cleo understood something since she was 5. Her father's silence wasn't fear. It was chess. He never reacted in rage. He waited for the full board to reveal itself. And then he moved. Now people didn't know how to meet his gaze. The same man they had barely looked at during boarding was now the centerpiece of a trending headline. Gone were the glances of impatience, replaced with hesitations dipped in regret. A young woman across from them pulled off her earbuds and gave Cleo a soft smile. Not pity, but recognition. As if to say, "I saw it too. And I'm sorry I didn't speak." A businessman, earlier occupied by spreadsheets on his tablet, closed the cover and gave a small nod toward Julius. It wasn't a thank you. It was acknowledgement. A small salute to a man who had just revealed the difference between power flaunted and power earned. Meanwhile, Karen stayed tucked near the service area, her world unraveling one thought at a time. Her supervisor's voice buzzed through her headset, asking for confirmation of an incident report. She blinked slowly, trying to come up with language that could rewrite what had already been recorded. But how do you reframe something when a crowd of strangers and the internet already hold the truth? Some flight attendants might have apologized, even begged. Karen stayed frozen beneath the illusion of standard operating procedure. But deep inside, she knew policy wouldn't protect her now. The descent began. The slight flattening of altitude tugged gently at the passengers' stomachs, but hearts carried something heavier. Julius glanced out the window. Somewhere below, hills rolled into wide city streets. He knew what was coming. The moment after the landing, the crew with anxious eyes, a supervisor waiting on the ground, statements to be collected, PR shields lifted. He didn't dread it. He welcomed it. This wasn't just about Cleo. This was about every child who had been touched without consent, spoken to with condescension, or treated with suspicion instead of compassion. Every parent who stayed silent because they had no choice. Every elegance lost to disrespect simply for entering the wrong cabin in the right skin. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. Cleo, curious, curled beside him to see. On the top of the page, he had quietly scrawled something. Reform starts at 30,000 feet. It wasn't a note to himself. It was a declaration. This story wouldn't end with going viral. It would end with systems falling, and better ones built in their place. Cleo looked up at him. Her cheeks no longer bore the red marks of humiliation. Instead, she bore something stronger now, a knowing that she had a father who didn't just protect her, but protected the dignity of every child like her. That sometimes the loudest authority doesn't shout. It sits quietly. It waits. And then it rises. Nothing hits quite like truth exposed at cruising altitude, especially when it lands before the plane does. By the time the aircraft touched down, the tension that had filled the cabin was no longer tension at all. It had matured into something else. Reckoning. There was no turbulence outside, but inside, everyone aboard had already been shaken. When the wheels hit the tarmac and the plane coasted forward along the runway, a strange hush washed over the passengers. Like they knew the real landing had already taken place, and now came the fallout. The lights brightened with a quiet flicker. The familiar chime of the seat belt sign turned off, but still no one stood. No eager rush for bags. No polite shuffle down the aisle. Instead, heads remained turned toward row 3, toward Julius Page and the little girl beside him, who had become symbols of something much larger than a boarding mishap. Julius didn't look around. He kept his gaze forward. He was calm, not with the stillness of silence, but the stillness of arrival. He had done what many dreamt of doing, not just standing against injustice, but turning the mirror back on the system and making it look at itself. The hard part was never watching it snap. The hard part was waiting for it to bend. And now, finally, it had. Cleo sat close, her cheek resting against her father's arm, small fingers tapping quietly against the armrest. She didn't know the specifics of what was unraveling now, but she knew something had changed, not just with the passengers, not just with her dad, but with her place in the world. She had seen fear in authority, and she had seen power look like her. The door opened, but it wasn't just the usual groan of landing protocol. This entrance came layered, first with protocol, then with presence. A ground crew manager stepped inside, followed closely by 2 more supervisors in pressed uniforms with clipped badges and carefully neutral expressions. Not TSA, not law enforcement. These were senior staff from Julius's private aviation company, and they were already aware. They weren't here to guide people out. They were here for correction. Karen, the flight attendant who had started it all, stood near the galley, posture stiff but trembling beneath the surface. She tried to hold the composure she had constructed throughout the flight, but it was unraveling fast. One of the supervisors approached her. His whispers were polite but professional. His face expressionless yet carrying the weight of instructions already decided before he boarded. Karen wasn't asked to explain. She wasn't asked to make a case. This wasn't an investigation, it was a decision. Her name was already known. So was the footage. So was the story. The videos had circulated faster than any apology could have. Across social media, the clip of Karen grabbing Cleo had over 4 million views by the time the plane landed. A trending thread labeled #FlyWithDignity grew every second, stitched together by real shared pain and the power of finally being believed. There were tweets and captions like, "She spoke to that little girl with more suspicion than anyone should use on a child. The twist? Her dad OWNS the airline. Let that sink in." Julius Page handled this with the kind of grace that presses change into the bones of corporations. Karen stood silently and was escorted from the plane, not in handcuffs, but in consequences far heavier than metal. Those next few moments felt slow, in the way clocks moved during change. Passengers stood now, some murmuring softly, others glancing at their phones, reading live updates from news outlets that had already picked the story up. A few passengers approached Julius quietly, not for photos, not for praise, but with meaningful nods and whispered words of respect. A way of saying thank you without cluttering it in performance. One attendant, young and visibly uneasy throughout the flight, approached near the ramp and slipped Julius a folded note before briskly turning away. It read nothing more than, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to say anything. But I saw you. Behind scenes, Julius's team was already working. Emails had been sent to the leadership board before touchdown. The legal team had launched an internal review, and HR reports from earlier passenger complaints involving Karen had surfaced. Small allegations, repeatedly dismissed, now revisited through wiser eyes. In patterns. Julius didn't need to direct anyone anymore. His silence had already spoken loudly enough. The company structure he had spent years designing, one built to respond to equity failures swiftly, had been triggered. He had built the kind of business that didn't just sell premium cabins, but carried premium values. And now it was time to live them. In the media room at headquarters, PR teams worked frantically, drafting statements meant to balance damage with accountability. But Julius didn't want press language. He wanted truth. He sent just one message to his team. No statements. No shielding. We admit. We change. That's simple. Passengers debarked slowly. But instead of awkward sidestepping and stiff smiles, now there were soft acknowledgments. Some thanked the crew who showed empathy. Some glanced at Cleo with the kind of warmth strangers usually reserve for family. No one rushed to leave. When Julius and Cleo finally exited, flashing lights met them at the terminal. But not cameras. Screens. Phones held by passengers who wanted the world to see not the scandal, but the grace of a father leading his daughter through it. An image went viral before the hour was over. Cleo holding her father's hand, walking down the jet bridge, her chin held high, his gaze steady forward. No need for waving, just walking, grounded, clear, true. And behind them, the echo of something permanent. This wasn't just an ending. It was the start of something long overdue. The viral moment had burned through the internet like wildfire. It had danced through trending hashtags and rolled across international time zones with swift, unrelenting force. But Julius Page wasn't interested in spotlight, or revenge, or applause. He wasn't looking for temporary outrage. He was looking for permanent change. In the days following the incident, media outlets flooded inboxes with interview requests. Editorials and op-eds formed on every major platform. Civil rights activists praised his restraint, while others questioned why someone so powerful would let his daughter endure such a humiliating moment at all. But Julius remained quiet. Not silent, but intentional. He understood something most people don't. That true reform doesn't begin with noise. It begins with reflection, and then action. He spoke only once, in a video message that streamed across the Skylux corporate network, shared internally among employees at all levels across continents and time zones. No fancy backdrop. No rehearsed lines. Just Julius in a plain chair, voice steady, eyes calm. He didn't retell the story. Everyone already knew. He simply acknowledged what the world had seen. He admitted that what happened on that plane wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, of something long-standing, of something this industry had quietly allowed to thrive in its premium cabins, training manuals, and whispered interactions. He called it what it was: systemic, subtle, and deadly in its quiet repetition. Employees watched in break rooms, on monitors in airport lounges, on cell phones in staff elevators. Some wept, not because they had committed the act, but because they had watched it happen in many forms over many years and said nothing. Julius's words weren't angry, but they held weight. A weight that could slice through bureaucracy and pretense. And then, as simply as he'd started, he announced a tectonic shift. No bureaucratic delay. No superficial apologies. Skylux Aviation, effective immediately, was undergoing a complete structural overhaul. Within the month, the airline established the Passenger Equity and Ethics Division, PED, a branch with investigative autonomy, reporting directly to the executive board and staffed by civilian rights experts, social workers, and unbiased review officers from third-party organizations. Employees who had been silenced in the past now had a direct channel, one free from retaliation. Flight attendants were retrained, not just on safety procedures, but on equity, empathy, and how to move through their roles without unconscious bias. The training was not a single session with a slide deck. It was immersive, collaborative, sometimes uncomfortable. It was change born through friction. And that was the point. Policies were rewritten. Rules that once governed who could sit where, how complaints were processed, and how escalation was handled were revised with transparency as the root. Passengers who had experienced discrimination from Skylux staff, some as far as 5 years back, were invited to share their stories directly with the PED. They weren't promised payouts. They were promised to be heard. Fully, without interruption, without suspicion. The company partnered with civil rights organizations and independent academic institutions to create an open-access report each quarter. One that measured not just revenue and passenger numbers, but dignity. A metric Julius had always believed mattered just as much. And through it all, Julius insisted on one thing: no personal spotlight. The campaign that followed, named Room at 30,000 Feet, featured no images of him, no signatures, only silhouettes of children and travelers of every race, class, and age, all seated equally, with the tagline beneath, "Belonging is not an upgrade." Meanwhile, Cleo returned to school quietly, as if nothing had happened. But her classmates knew. So did her teachers. She carried no arrogance about her father's identity, no grand retelling of the incident. What she did carry now was awareness and a sense of place. She had learned that power was not about who speaks loudest. It resided in standing firm with dignity, even when everything around you tries to shrink you. One afternoon, while she was walking through an airport months after the incident, a Skylux flight attendant spotted her. This time, she was met not with suspicion, but with a gentle nod and a smile, the kind reserved not for VIPs, but for someone who had changed the flight path of an entire industry. Change rippled. Other airlines took notice. Policy guides began to reference the Page Protocol. Competitor airlines introduced passenger protection policies inspired by the changes Julius championed. Panels were formed. Culture shifted. And for once, the fear of accountability no longer belonged to the passengers. It belonged to the system. Julius kept flying. Not always private. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Cleo. But he noticed the differences now. Not just in how flight crews treated him, but how they treated strangers who looked like him. Travelers with accents. Parents with children too energetic, too curious, too brown for comfort. That was the real marker of impact. When change reaches people you'll never meet. Eventually, the viral wave of the story passed, replaced by new headlines. The public moved on, as they always do. But Skylux didn't. Their truth had flown too far to turn back. And passengers remembered. Every time they stepped onto a plane and were greeted with respect. Every time a child wandered into first class and was met not with suspicion, but with a smile. Every time silence became action. Because of one day, one girl, one man who chose to wait not for a fight but for the right moment to rise. If the story moved you, if it reminded you that justice doesn't always need a microphone, it just needs courage, hit that subscribe button. Share your thoughts. Your voice matters more than you know. Because dignity should never require a boarding pass. And equity should fly first always.